All right, the River War. Well, as you touched upon, and we talked about this quite some time ago, very early on, the western part of the Confederacy had several rivers that cut into it, and these offered the Union great invasion routes, much better and much more efficient than trying to go over land or even by rail, which the rails tended to get destroyed by people like Nathan Bedford Forrest and others. But the rivers, you think about all these rivers, the Mississippi cuts right into the Confederacy, the Tennessee River and the Cumberland, which go through Kentucky and Tennessee and others. And the Union realized early on that it would need a river fleet to take advantage of these watery invasion routes. And the Confederacy, of course, wanted to stop this from happening, and so they built fortifications among all of them. All right, so let's talk specifically about Union River vessels. What were they like and how were they different from open sea vessels? Riverboats had to have powerful guns, of course, to go against Confederate fortifications, but they had to also have shallow drafts so that they could float in as little as 10 feet of water. And when I say shallow drafts, that's a fancy way of just saying they can't go too far below the water because sometimes the rivers are quite shallow, especially in times of drought or in times where there hasn't been a lot of rain. And the first set of Union River vessels were made of wood, and they were called timber-clads, of course, because they're clad or made or built with timber or wood, and they were commissioned in June of 1861. But naturally, the Union eventually, once it's able to, they switched to ironclads. 7 of these were built early in the war, and the river ironclads were about 175 feet long, and they had slanted sides, and they typically had about 13 guns. So they weren't monitor class ships. They were just more traditional design. They could move 5 miles per hour upstream and 8 miles per hour downstream, which is not blindingly fast, but it's pretty good pace. And they were all in action by January of 1862.
Yeah, and from what I've seen of riverboats, they're very box shaped because you mentioned they don't have too much of they have a very shallow draft. Would these military vessels also have that similar box shaped riverboat appearance?
They were a little bit more sleek. They had slanted sides. So don't think like a box with a turret on the top like a monitor. Think more like the Merrimack or the Virginia, a little bit more of a traditional ship design with slanting sides. And they were designed that way. One reason they were designed that way is so that shells and other artillery and things that landed on them would just hit and just roll right off into the water. Yeah. All right. So let's talk about the first naval engagement. And we've already touched on these, but let's talk about them again because it's been a long time. And these are key river battles. First of all, Fort Henry. Fort Henry was in the state of Tennessee, and it was along the Cumberland River. And the Union fleet was commanded by Andrew Foote. On February 2nd of 1862, Foote and 7 vessels escorted General Grant. Still, at this time, of course, he was in the West. About 17,000 soldiers. So together, the Navy and the Army are marching toward Fort Henry. Fort Henry was poorly designed. It was too low to the ground. It wasn't high up. In fact, it was so low that the fort would take in water when the river flooded. That's not very good, is it? You don't want your fort to start flooding right in the middle of an attack. And it did. And sure enough, it did this right before the Union boats arrived. One of the Union boats actually sailed into and out of the fort itself. That's just hard to imagine. We weren't thinking, guys, when we designed this.
Going to get trench foot inside the fort. Fort foot, they call it.
No kidding. On February 6th, the Union boats bombarded the fort. The defenders surrendered. And this is the only time in the war that a fort actually surrendered to a fleet. So they surrendered not to an army, but to the Navy. And this opened the Tennessee River. I think I said the wrong river a minute ago. Tennessee River, not Cumberland. On the Cumberland was Fort Donelson. After defeating Fort Henry, the Union fleet went back up the Tennessee. They had to go back north to the Ohio River and then get into the Cumberland to Fort Donelson. On February 15th, the fleet fired on the fort, but they were turned back. Donelson was much tougher, much more powerful guns, much better situated than Fort Henry. The next day, the fleet attacked again while Grant's army surrounded it. The fort surrendered this time, and now the Cumberland River was open to the Union Navy. So the Tennessee and the Cumberland River were pretty much wide open, and most of Middle and East Tennessee soon fell into Union hands. So we see here that control of the rivers leads to control of the state, just about, except for, I think I said East. I keep making mistakes here. It's Middle and West Tennessee. East Tennessee is going to take a lot longer, as we saw in our lectures or our lessons earlier episodes.
Very, very critical. I mean, for provisioning troops, for sending supplies up and down, think of them as watery rail lines. And throughout history, it's always cheaper and more effective in terms of moving tonnage to send things by water, by boat, than it is to send it over land. Not quite as true with the advent of the rail lines, but you can blow up a rail line. You can't blow up a river. So control of this for logistics later on of river lines is very critical.
It really is. And during the Battle of Shiloh, one of our key battles that we talked about, major battle in the West, very early in the war, 2 Union gunboats helped the Army. They were on the river, and they were blasting into the Confederate lines. So I'm not going to say they turned the tide or anything like that, but they sure did help. Mm-hmm. All right, let's talk about the Mississippi now. Island number 10 was... surprise, surprise! It was a little island in the river, and it had a Confederate fortress. It fell to a joint gunboat and Army force in early 1862. New Orleans and Baton Rouge, we saw they fell in 1862 as well. In May of 1862, a Union flotilla faced a group of Confederate rams near Memphis. We talked about the rams earlier. 2 Union vessels were sunk, but they were later raised. Another naval battle ensued, and Memphis fell soon afterwards. So in 1862, these these Confederate strongholds on the rivers they're dropping like flies. At Vicksburg, the Union River Fleet played a key role in the capture of the city. We talked about that in quite some detail when we talked about Vicksburg, how the Union River flotilla just bypassed the fort, just ran the guns, and they took some heat, but they got past it. Most of them survived, and then they ferried Grant's troops across the river, enabling him to attack Vicksburg. So, in sum, without the support of the Union River Fleet, the war in the West would not have gone so well. It played a critical role in helping out the Army.
And remember, when James and I talked about Vicksburg, we said that some people call it not the turning point of the war, but a turning point of the war, because now the Confederacy is both blocked off by the naval blockade, but it's essentially blocked off to the west from Texas, from Mexico, from getting those supplies. That's because of the importance of a blockade. That's because the importance of naval warfare, of ferrying supplies by means of water. So you can't discount it if Vicksburg is a turning point in the war, because how important it is to get access to the sea or to get access by the river networks. And so speaking of which, we've talked about the blockade, we've talked about the River War. So how about naval conflict on the open seas? What's happening there?
All righty. So we talked about, again, the Confederates were trying to break up the blockade, reduce its effectiveness, get through it, things like that. The Confederacy actually commissioned some ironclads, and their job was to go sneak up on the Union vessels that were keeping the blockade and try to destroy them. Some ships would be equipped with a ram. Again, we've seen rams in the past. These ramming ships were built in British shipyards. So the British were kind of turning a blind eye to this. They weren't supposed to be doing this. They were a neutral nation, but there were some British companies that were building these ships for the Confederacy. Some of them got away, but others were confiscated by the British Navy after American protests. And you got to give credit here to the American ambassador to Great Britain, who was Charles Francis Adams, the son of John Quincy and grandson of John Adams. Oh. He played a key role in getting this to stop, basically. We can't have a country that we're technically friends with, Britain, allowing these ships to be built that are destroying our blockade ships. So the ironclads had very limited success. Then you also had privateers. Privateers have a long and glorious tradition in naval history. They're essentially a pirate that is given sanction by a government. So Jefferson Davis offered anyone who would become a privateer a commission in the Confederate Navy, or at least maybe not officially in the Navy, more like an irregular captain or irregular unit. But so if you, let's say you're a Confederate citizen and you have a ship and you have a crew, you can go and attack Union vessels that are out in the open sea, merchant vessels, and you can capture them, capture the crew, or just take away all the stuff, steal everything, and bring it back, and you get to keep it. So you deprive the Union of much needed supplies or money or whatever, and you give some of it to the government, and you keep some, and you become rich. Many Southern ship owners responded, but overall they didn't have a huge effect. What did have more of an effect were commerce raiders. Commerce, and we touched on this earlier in our when we discussed the very, very end of the war, but let's go into a little bit more detail. Commerce raiders, unlike blockade runners, remember we talked about blockade running ships were designed to be small and fast. These are also designed to be fast, but they're designed to be heavily armed. Their job was to attack and capture or destroy northern merchant marine vessels. So they're like privateers, but they are actually officially sanctioned and run by the Confederate government, the Confederate Navy. They would be fast enough to outrun Union naval vessels. That was the plan anyway. And there's a colorful character we'll bring in here. We haven't mentioned him at all yet. The most famous commerce raider in the Confederacy was Captain Raphael Semmes, and his first command was the Sumter, appropriately named after Fort Sumter, the crew of which included 20 Confederate Marines. Interestingly enough, did you know there were Confederate Marines?
I did not. That's interesting.
The few, the proud. There's very few, 20 of them. No, there were more than 20, but this ship had 20 alone. All right, so in June of 1861, this commerce raider, led by Raphael Semmes, the Sumter, they set sail into the Gulf of Mexico. And after 6 months, it had captured 18 Union merchant vessels. That's pretty good. 6 months, 18. They captured 18 merchant vessels. That's 3 a month. Finally, Semmes had to put in at Gibraltar, and he was forced to give up his ship, but he personally got away and he escaped to London. In the summer of 1862, Semmes left England with 3 ships now, so he's got not one new ship, but 3. And in the Azores, one of the ships was converted into the CSS Alabama. And the Alabama sailed around the world, literally. Along this route, the Alabama captured 65 U.S. merchant ships.
Wow.
Pretty impressive, but compared to the total number of U.S. merchant ships, that's not that many, but still, it's significant. Off the coast of France, the Alabama was confronted by the USS Kearsarge. I don't know if I pronounced that right, but I've only read it. But anyway, they fought a battle on June 15th. Thousands of people watched this sea battle from the coast. It's great entertainment if you can find it, right? Just one-on-one, one ship on another, head-to-head.
The Civil War in Europe. You don't think of that very much.
You really don't. Yeah, you certainly. But here you got these ships duking it out off the coast of France. Well, the Alabama was sunk. The Union ship was better. Semmes once again escapes. And other major Confederate commerce raiders were the Florida, who took 55 prizes, and the Shenandoah, who took 38 prizes. And the Shenandoah, as we saw in a previous episode, took on the U.S. whaling fleet in the Bering Sea. This was after Appomattox. It did not surrender until November of 1865. It actually sailed away. Surrender is not the right word.
So this is, for geography, people who aren't aware, this is between Russia and Alaska.
Yeah, and we didn't even control Alaska at the time. Not that that really matters, but it's just, your point is it was way far away from all the rest of the fighting. So the Civil War wasn't just fought in the United States. I mean, we see naval battles off the coast of France, off the coast of Alaska, which at the time belonged to Russia. And so it went all over the place, at least the naval war did. All in all, to sum up, commerce raiders destroyed 257 northern merchant ships. But despite this, as I mentioned before, that's really just a drop in the bucket because there were thousands and thousands of Union merchant ships. Union commerce was not greatly affected. Many North